Welcome to Z Analysis. I'm your host Jake, and we're starting off with two shocking facts that'll set the stage for today's discussion. The US has spent over $2.3 trillion on military operations in the Middle East since 2001, with $1.1 trillion of that going towards the war in Iraq. To put that into perspective, that's roughly 13% of our country's total national debt, which currently stands at around $28.4 trillion. The latest development in this region is causing even more tension between the US and Iran. Meanwhile, Iran's economy is suffering greatly, with inflation rates soaring to over 40% in their currency, the rial, having lost nearly 60% of its value against the US dollar in the past year alone. These economic struggles are being felt by the Iranian people, with over 20% of the population living below the poverty line. As we dive into this topic, it's essential to understand the historical context and current situation. The US has been imposing sanctions on Iran since 1979, with the most recent round of sanctions targeting Iran's oil exports, which account for over 80% of the country's revenue.
I'm Sarah, and I'm also your host today, and I have to say, those numbers are staggering, Jake. As we explore this topic, I want to make sure our listeners understand the human side of this conflict. We'll be discussing the latest updates and what they mean for Americans. Our topic for today is the escalating tensions between the US and Iran, with Iran accusing the US of a grave violation of the ceasefire. I'm excited to dive into this complex issue and break it down for our listeners. We'll also be looking at the potential impact on the global economy, with the price of oil already increasing by over 10% in the past month.
So, let's start with some background on this topic. The US and Iran have had a complicated relationship for decades, with the 1979 Iranian Revolution marking a significant turning point. The US imposed sanctions on Iran in response to the revolution, which have been in place ever since. In 2015, the US, along with other world powers, signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran nuclear deal. However, in 2018, the US withdrew from the deal, reimposing sanctions on Iran, which has led to the current situation. The US has also been providing military support to Iran's neighbors, including Saudi Arabia, which has received over $3.6 billion in military aid from the US in the past year alone.
That's right, Jake, and it's essential to understand the history behind this conflict. The Iran nuclear deal was meant to limit Iran's nuclear program in exchange for relief from economic sanctions. However, with the US withdrawal from the deal, Iran has started to resume its nuclear activities, which has led to increased tensions between the two countries. I'd like to ask, Jake, what role do you think the US's withdrawal from the deal has played in the current situation? The US's decision to withdraw from the deal has been met with widespread criticism, with over 60% of Americans believing that the US should have stayed in the deal.
The current situation is that Iran has accused the US of a grave violation of the ceasefire, which has led to a significant escalation of tensions between the two countries. The US has been conducting military operations in the region, including airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, which have been targeting Iranian-backed militias. In response, Iran has launched missile strikes against US military bases in Iraq, which has raised concerns about a potential war between the two countries. The economic impact of this conflict is already being felt, with the US spending over $1.5 billion per week on military operations in the Middle East.
That's right, Jake, and it's alarming to see the situation escalating so quickly. I'd like to ask, what's the latest update on the ceasefire negotiations? Are there any signs of a potential de-escalation of tensions? The US and Iran have been in indirect talks, with the US seeking a new deal that addresses Iran's nuclear program, as well as its ballistic missile program and support for militant groups in the region. However, these talks have been met with skepticism, with many experts believing that a deal is unlikely in the near future.
The impact on Americans is significant, with the conflict already affecting the economy and potentially leading to higher oil prices, which could increase the cost of gasoline, heating oil, and other petroleum products. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, a 10% increase in oil prices could lead to a 2.5% increase in the price of gasoline. This could have a ripple effect on the entire U.S. economy, with over 70% of Americans relying on gasoline to commute to work. Additionally, the conflict could lead to a decrease in consumer spending, with over 60% of Americans saying they would cut back on discretionary spending if the economy were to slow down.
That's right, Jake, and it's essential to consider the human impact of this conflict. I'd like to ask, how might this conflict affect American jobs and daily life? With the US already facing a slowing economy, the last thing we need is a conflict that could lead to higher prices and decreased consumer spending. The US is already facing a trade deficit of over $500 billion, and a conflict with Iran could exacerbate this issue. I'd like to add that the conflict could also lead to a decrease in tourism and travel, with over 20% of Americans saying they would be less likely to travel abroad if the conflict were to escalate.
Expert analysis suggests that the US and Iran are engaged in a high-stakes game of chess, with both sides trying to outmaneuver each other. According to a report by the Council on Foreign Relations, the US has the military advantage, but Iran has the strategic advantage, with its location in the heart of the Middle East and its ability to disrupt oil supplies. The report also notes that a war between the US and Iran could lead to a significant increase in oil prices, with some estimates suggesting that prices could rise by as much as 50%. I'd like to add that the conflict could also have a significant impact on the global economy, with over 30% of the world's oil supply coming from the Middle East.
That's right, Jake, and it's essential to consider the expert analysis. I'd like to ask, what do experts think is the most likely outcome of this conflict? Do they think a deal can be reached, or are we headed for a further escalation of tensions? The experts I've spoken to believe that a deal is possible, but it would require significant concessions from both sides. The US would need to lift some of the sanctions on Iran, while Iran would need to agree to limits on its nuclear program and ballistic missile program.
So, what can Americans do today to stay informed and prepared for the potential impact of this conflict? First, stay up to date with the latest news and developments. Second, consider diversifying your investments to reduce your exposure to the oil market. And third, reach out to your elected representatives to express your concerns about the conflict and its potential impact on the US economy. You can also support organizations that provide humanitarian aid to those affected by the conflict, such as the Red Cross or the UN Refugee Agency.
That's right, Jake, and I'd like to add that it's essential to support organizations that provide fact-based information and analysis on the conflict. We'll continue to provide updates and analysis on this topic, so be sure to tune in to our future episodes. I'd also like to ask our listeners to share their thoughts and questions on social media using the hashtag #ZAnalysis.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Z Analysis. If you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analysis and discussion on the latest trending topics. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest episodes. We'll see you in the next one.
And don't forget to follow us on social media for more updates and behind-the-scenes insights into our episodes. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one.